Today, I'd like to begin by reminding us of what the concern we're focusing on in these conversations really is. Let's remember that the basic question is, how do we explain the need for any kind of therapy? How do we explain the origin of psychological or emotional problems? Where do they originate? And I've already stated that I do not believe that simply describing them as a medical problem, as something that needs to be cured, like mental illness, is at all effective in helping us to understand what we really need when we need therapy, when therapy is merited. I saw something just yesterday that, if anything, convinced me of the need for this kind of talk. Now remember, I call this learning life effective talk therapy. And the implication is that that kind of effectiveness is not here in the kind of model that we presently have. What I saw yesterday on a program on TV that I like very much was that a medical expert was called in to describe why a certain criminal was acting in the criminal way that he was. And he described this criminal's activity entirely in terms of his pathology. And he was very detailed, as he would be if he had memorized the DSM, about what aspects of this man's personality led him to be the criminal that he was, the way he was acting. And he just named a series of floating symptoms: delusional, making up stories, feeling persecuted, so that he finally sums it all up as having the persecuted delusional complex. And there was absolutely no understanding of what would cause this. It was just a series of symptoms, much as you would describe if someone were having a cold or had a serious case of tuberculosis or something similar. And so there was no way of understanding this other than a deep pathology, something profoundly wrong that this guy was suffering from. And sure enough, at the end of the program, this man the criminal ended up being shot, because it was the only way to deal with him. Now, what I want to do is pose the question, what do I see as lying at the foundation of any real need for therapy? That's the question I'd like to address in the next several talks. And the first part of that, what that's going to require is that we look at it from several different perspectives. In other words, there are several different important angles that I'd like to approach that topic from without leaving it. In other words, they're all aspects of one subject, but they're different considerations. Now, the first aspect of this that I'd like to think about is one I've already suggested, that we humans are, in fact, evolutionary creatures. We have evolved as part of the life on this planet. And like much of that life, if not all of it, we spend an early part of our existence learning how to be ourselves. Now, the first thing I want to talk about here is what I mean by the word learning when I apply it to us humans. In other words, from the day of birth, if not before, to, let's say, 18 or 19 years when we are matured and are ready to move into the world as a formed self, we are listening in several important ways. And I don't think we give ourselves as much credit for that as needs to be given. The first thing I think we need to note is the way we see. In other words, we are very visual, and a great deal of our information comes to us by what we see around us. Well, that means that a child of 1 year, 2 years, 5 years, growing 10, 12, 15 years, is seeing a large number of things much more than he's looking at. In other words, there's the reality that he may focus on, or she may focus on any given day, any given moment, any given experience, but there's a lot more going on that he or she sees, takes in, absorbs as part of the picture that he or she is registering as what goes on in human life. We're listening. We're tremendously attuned to sound, and we take in what's said, but more than what's said, we take in the tones of surrounding noises, we take in the tone of voice, the edge that's on the words. We hear much more when a sentence is stated than simply the content of the words. To think that we only hear that is already to ignore what we're listening to most of the time. But then there's the bodily aspect of it. In other words, there's an impact on the energy of ourselves that we take in when something is going on, when we're experiencing. Now that's clear if we're doing something vigorous and energetic of the body, like ice skating or playing baseball or any of those activities, ballroom dancing or whatever. But there's much more than that going on if we're just sitting in a classroom quietly, surrounded by 40 other students. If we're listening to the screech of the chalk on the blackboard, if we're sharing the fun of a group at a party and we're part of a moving group, all of that is taken in by the learning body that hears this kind of thing. And so we are constantly learning in multi-dimensions. The biggest mistake we can make is to think that we're just doing that kind of learning. But let's not underestimate the importance of that kind of learning. We have a brain that thinks, and that's one of the major differences that we've evolved to have, one that's very flexible and cagey and looking around. So there's the explicit nomenclature, the name that we give to things, and the kind of explicit thought that we can have about something. This is that. This means that. I see A and I see B, and therefore I conclude to C. That kind of thing. It's also part of our learning, you see. Now, the mistake that can be made here is that we isolate any one of those things. We think of that alone as the kind of learning that we do. That's why I'm saying this, really, because I'm afraid that when I use the word learning, it's automatically going to mean this kind of brain learning, when I mean much more. The way I like to say it for myself personally is I listen with my mind. That's my whole self. So what's my focus here is to see the enormous sensitivity, that's the word I like for it, that we have as human beings. That we're listening in all those dimensions all the time, and that we may or may not be aware of that listening, of that learning that we're doing, but we are doing that. Now, what that leads directly to, in my view, is what I like to call my definition of the unconscious. Now, Freud alerted us to the existence, and he essentially created the field of therapy by alerting us to the existence of this reality. But I think it needs further refinement of definition. The way I like to say it and sum it up, and I think this is important, is that if we are listening as creatures with the kind of multifaceted sensitivity that I'm talking about, and we are always listening that way, then every one of our experiences in life, the smallest and the loudest, to the biggest and the most infinitesimal in terms of detail, registers in us as creatures. And as a result, we grow up, we go into our years with a tremendously complex, detailed, rich memory of every single experience that we have, without exception. In other words, what I'm positing here is that we humans, always, everywhere, at all times, I mean to be as absolute as that, remember every single thing that has ever been said, been done, happened to us. So much so that we cannot recall it all. And I want that paradox to stand. There's so much there that we cannot recall it all, but it's all there, you see. Now, what that means is that for the rest of my life and yours, when something resonates similarly to what we have already learned, we will register it. We will hear it. We may not always recognize it, but we will register it. Now, what I'm driving at here, and this is the important point, is that it's there, it's happening, and we may not know that that's the case. That's why we call it the unconscious, because we cannot carry the load of being explicitly aware of every single thing that's ever happened. That's too much. But because we are so enormously sensitive and we are listening in all these multidimensionals, we do take it in and we do remember it and we do have it as part of our experience. But at the same time, we can live a life of every day without ever alluding to this body of learning that is actually in us. And so that's the first aspect of this source of emotional problems and the need for therapy that we can look at. In other words, it's something I like to emphasize very much. It is always happening. It is always there. Yes, it's happening. Yes, I'm doing it, and I may not know it at all. In other words, it's possible for human beings to be walking around responding to a kind of learned script of which they are not at all aware. My clients know that I use a very cynical formulation for this. The way I like to say it is, we are talking about a reality that is in every one of us and is operating because of this multidimensional learning that we're all doing all the time. But 99.5% of people, conservatively estimated, have no idea what we're talking about. And if we start out with that assumption, we're beginning to look at one of the aspects of what makes the world of therapy so complex and something we need to talk about in the way that we're doing.